Hello, and welcome to the 104th episode of From Alpha to Omega. Today is Thursday, the 26th of September 2019, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. This week, we welcome James, who I met recently at the CPGB Communist University in Goldsmiths this summer. We give a thorough analysis of the event, our thoughts on the talks, the people we met there, and our overall general impression. For those unaware, MacNair, whose book Revolutionary Strategy we are currently studying on the podcast, is a member of the CPGB. He gave a number of talks related to the book, and this was where I got to sit down with him and talk about Brexit, along with a very noisy fridge in the most recent episodes. If you'd like to support the show, you can join the Patreon gang for only $5 a month, which works out at only $1 an episode. Patrons get access to all the Patron-only bonus episodes, the right to vote on the reading group series, and other cool stuff too. When we reach 100 patrons, we'll be producing a second Patron-only podcast every month. If you'd like to comment on the show, please do so on the YouTube channel, and make sure to like, subscribe and share. You can also join me on Facebook or Twitter too. Okay, to the discussion. So we have here today, welcome to the gaff, we've got James. How's it going?
I'm good.
I met James there when we both went to the CPGB PCC Communist University in Goldsmiths. How long ago now? A month ago?
About a month and a half ago, I think.
Yeah. So we thought we'd do, is it that long?
I think so. It's at the beginning of August and now it's almost the end of September.
Oh, Christ almighty. Right, so it was like, 6 weeks ago or something. So we thought we'd do a bit of a review. So, first of all, James, who are you?
I am a guy in my late 30s from London, and I thought it might be interesting to discuss that I kind of met Tom through doing his podcast. And I think that in and of itself is interesting in that we actually met in the real world at the CPGB's Communist University, because I think we're both...
Meat space.
We meted in meat space. We're both individuals who've got radicalised later in life, so didn't experience one of these groups in our formative years at university or in our 20s. And we've been both reading theory and reading history, and I found Tom's podcast, and that was really helpful. And I think that there's this dynamic at play where when you're engaging with a lot of this stuff in the abstract and at the theoretical level, there comes a point where you feel you have to engage with this stuff practically in the real world.
Yeah. And
so for a couple of years now, I've been reading The Weekly Worker, and I think I came across it originally from, again, listening to a podcast. So in a way, it's this form of being an alienated Marxist, alone, listening to other people who are reading the same things as you and thinking the same things as you, but not really engaging with it in the real world. So it's quite a strange experience. And I'd encountered MacNair, I think, either through Derek Vaughan or Donald Parkinson, either on Swampside or on Derek's podcast. And I'd read his book, and I'd found it a very clear, succinct and clarifying statement about how these politics are still relevant and can still be applied, and the power of looking back at the mistakes and errors of the 20th century in order to learn and build a politics that still has relevance and can still be powerful. And as a result of that, I started reading The Weekly Worker. And I think The Weekly Worker has a reputation on the radical left for being a kind of a scurrilous gossip-mongering rag of the left. But I think there's a serious point in there that they do see it as valid to critique their contemporaries. And as with, and I think this is what's relevant, it's one of the reasons I even went to Communist University, was that there are many lines the CPGB have that are the closest to my own. So of all the sects I've looked at and all the lines, the ones that resound with me are theirs. So
what are they?
The way that they view the balance of forces within the Labour Party, a lot of their foreign policy writing, and this is another thing about The Weekly Worker, that it's really good at covering foreign policy in Turkey, in Iran. The line they tend to take on imperialism, I usually broadly agree with. a lot of their analysis of the UK situation, so both the Labour Party situation, but also the broader conflict, things like Brexit. A lot of the stuff you read, and it's better than most of the bourgeois press. So, it's an interesting publication to read beyond the theoretical stuff that you get from people like MacNair. So MacNair's in there, every other week writing a new article. So you're getting that, and you're getting contemporary stuff that is pretty good. Obviously not all of it, but a lot of it is good stuff.
Yeah, so we met, we went, what was the one that we went to, what was the first one we met at?
Well, I think prior to the one we went to, I was actually there on the first Saturday at the opening session, which was Graham Bash, who was speaking about the
Labour Party.
It was about the situation with the Labour Party. Is how can we transform the Labour Party into a vehicle for socialism?
What was that like?
Well, interestingly enough, there were cries from the floor because he opened by saying, "I'm not going to talk about the title." So he didn't fulfill his booking remit. But he essentially gave an overview of the current situation within the Labour Party and how it is acting as a vehicle for socialism or not, what the limitations are. It was pretty interesting. There wasn't anything that I think, if you're kind of paying attention to contemporary politics, you might not necessarily already know, particularly if you're looking at Labour politics from a kind of more radical left perspective. What was interesting was that historically he's a member of the Labour Representation Committee, it's one of these smaller groups that have existed within the Labour Party. Probably the most well-known is the CLPD, the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, which was John Landsman, who now runs Momentum, is associated with. The LRC is well known now because it's one of the factions that John McDonnell has historically been associated with. So Corbyn's often kind of been backed from the CLPD, and McDonnell's always been backed by the LRC. And they act as kind of internal pressure groups, rallying members, attempting to make changes in internal democracy, so they will advise members who are within CLPs to vote for certain motions, that kind of thing. And Bash has been, he might even be a founding member of the LRC, I don't know, he's been associated with them for a long time. But I think for a lot of the people in that kind of milieu of the Labour Party, this Corbyn moment is do or die for these guys. They really see it as this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And he kind of made that point again and again. And it was interesting that from the floor, MacNair kind of counselled against putting all of your hope in that one basket. He was arguing that kind of, the point that he's made in the book. Strategy of patience, be careful, have to wait for the forces to gather. And he, cited Syriza. And it was interesting how violently Bash reacted to that from the chair. I would say of all of the talks I went to over the course of the week, I didn't see... It wasn't, he just couldn't believe what MacNair was saying. He was like, what are you talking about? We've got this amazing opportunity. What are you talking about? He was like, get out of here. And he didn't quite say it. He tried to remain comradely, but he was sitting in the chair shaking his head. So that was quite interesting. And then because I work and I have kids, so maybe it's important to talk about the form of the Communist University.
Yeah, go on.
So it's in Goldsmiths. And most people who are there are residents, so they're staying in halls of residence. And because it's during the summer, the students are gone. So Goldsmiths are making money from empty halls. And I think you'll be able to speak better than me to what kind of camaraderie between the people who were staying there kind of that created. But it also meant that there were some comrades from other places aside from the UK. So and you managed to talk to those guys. So I'd be really interested to hear about some of the cats that you met who were attending and staying.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was some young lads from the Dutch Socialist Party, and there was 4, maybe 5 of them. One is a Dutch podcaster who got out, said I'd go on his show, and I said I'd have him on to talk about what they're doing, but I can't remember where I put his email address. So they were actually, some of them had actually been listening to the MacNair series. One of them had been listening to the MacNair series we're doing on the podcast, but they've actually been doing the MacNair stuff for real. They've been in the Socialist Party in Holland, which is at one stage a few years, like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, it was getting like 30% in the polls, like it's kind of like a weird ex-Maoist / Trot group of some type. And these kids were trying to they were young guys, like some of them, you know, maybe not even 20. One older guy who was a podcaster, but they were trying to democratise the party and take away the power from the Central Committee. Let the General Assembly or whatever be the highest body. And it was really cool to talk to these young guys. Like, they were actually trying it. They were in they were doing it. They had a kind of essentially a faction, but it was, I think factions might have been even banned in their organisation. Same old rubbish, all these organisations. So it was like really cool to talk to these kids. You know, you're doing the podcast and you're sitting in your room or you're reading theory on your own, and then you talk to some kids who are goddamn actually doing something in a party that I think now in Holland they've had some really bad political decisions and the party is back down to like 5% or something. But it's like still 5%. Like a party that would have 5% in any major Western country, like a European country, like with PR, is a major party. It's an actual party with land and buildings and stuff where they can host stuff.
Actual infrastructure.
And money. You know what I mean? As opposed to like, you know, like the CPGB was 30 I don't know how many people, but like whatever, small number of trots that meet in pubs and stuff like this, you know. So it's like, it'd be much bigger than the Green Party in the UK, you know, for example. It'd probably be many times the size of the Green Party in the UK with representatives in Parliament. So that was really cool, to be honest with you. It was quite inspiring for me to meet them guys. You know, it's hard to know people's politics when you meet them, but the guys seem kind of sound. They're talking and arguing about the underlying stuff of re-democratising the fact that it should be even a thing on the left, that you have to democratise. It's beyond belief. It's beyond belief. How you can read Marx and Engels or any of these people and then come up with party structures that are anti-democratic. It's goddamn beyond belief. Next, what's next?
Later in the week, which I think was maybe the day that we met, I think it was the Thursday. So in the morning, it was Hillel Tichtum was speaking, who's another writer who I encountered through his work in the Weekly Worker.
He's really good.
And I'd actually hoped to go the day before, because I think of the two talks that he did, the talk he did the day before, which was on the decline of socioeconomic systems in our epoch, would have maybe been, for me personally, the more interesting one. But the one on Thursday was also really interesting, and it drew on Tichtum's own experiences of essentially being an exchange student in the USSR in the 70s. Because he was over there studying for, I think he said 5 or 6 years.
Did he do his PhD over there? I think he did.
He did his master's or maybe finished his PhD in the UK. He did say the talk, and we should say
they turned down his PhD. He did it. Did he do a PhD like in Moscow, and they turned it down because he basically said,
and he came over and finished it in the UK. Yeah, and I think we should say to people listening, if they're interested in checking out these talks, I don't know if they've been uploaded yet, but the CPGB are usually really good at.
We're live streaming them, and I think they're probably going on Vimeo. Yeah. Most of them seem to be on Vimeo. Let me just check.
So people after the fact can go and check out these talks and make of them what they will. But yeah, Tichtum spoke, and it was moving. I mean, it was a very kind of subjective appraisal of just how difficult life was, and it was all kind of moving towards, the title of the talk was Predicting the Collapse of the Soviet Union. And the way that Tichtum described it was that for him it was absolutely no surprise, and he was almost surprised that it didn't happen sooner, you know, because he described, and he kept reiterating again and again this word backwards. He kept just saying how backwards it was, and he would describe, you know, daily life being very difficult, even finding a ballpoint pen or riding on the tram. All of these things he found very difficult to do while he was there. And it was interesting. It was very kind of personal. It was interesting because it was him. I expected him to go more into the raw economics, you know, what is undergirding this backwardsness. But it was really interesting in that it was this kind of quite moving kind of like, you know, quite diaristic kind of portrayal of what it was like. And he was almost like you could tell what was going to happen. It was, you know, everywhere around you. So that was really interesting. And then after him, it was Chris Knight, who is a London-based academic who runs the Radical Anthropology Group, which I think is based out of SOAS, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
But his talk was entitled Noam Chomsky and Me. And it was pretty interesting in that I didn't know his personal history, but a lot of the stuff that he was talking about was stuff that I'd heard, because I've been, again, going back to my backstory, as a teenager, I was a kind of a not particularly theoretically rigorous kind of an anarchist, because I was into punk rock music. I have a black flag tattoo, used to go to punk gigs. So I kind of was like, I'm an anarchist, but I didn't really know what that meant. It wasn't like I was reading Bakunin,
Yeah.
I was just into black flag. But I read Chomsky, and Chomsky always made sense to me. And I was like, this guy, he's figured the whole thing out. And much more recently, you'd see these kind of Twitter threads of people talking about all these reasons why Chomsky sucks. And then, people had kind of debunked the debunkers and whatever. But a lot of the stuff that Chris Knight was talking about was stuff that you kind of hear whispers of. But it was pretty interesting. He kind of went into Chomsky's time at MIT and what was going on at MIT during the anti-Vietnam protests, which was essentially a lot of US military testing. And Knight's done a lot of research. It's not like I'm peer-reviewing the guy's stuff.
No, he sent me his book, actually, to interview about it. His major point was that Chomsky was like working in a place where they were doing military stuff. Well, and he was working on for fighter pilots that they could understand your brainwaves and do what you wanted without having to use cockpit controls and all this.
Well, according to Knight, he claims that the linguistic computer programming that Chomsky was doing to model language was utilised by the US Air Force in missile-guided technology. That's his claim.
Yeah, I would be extraordinarily surprised at that. I think that a lot of times in America, what they would do is they would get like basic research and they would put a MOD or a Department of Defense funding for it, and they would make up a reason for why. Oh yeah, we'll be able to make fighter pilots that will be able to understand somebody's internal grammar, and then they'll be able to respond instantly. But really, that it's so far away from ever being used, and I think like it's just like a cover for R&D, state-funded R&D.
Yeah, that seems far closer to how I've always perceived things to be.
Yeah, and like Chomsky himself would say that research goal was completely unrealistic. Like nowhere close to being able to be possible. To this day, he would say that.
Yeah. And
so it sounds like it's a guy trying to pick a fight with Chomsky and write a book.
And sell a book.
Yeah, that was my take on it. I think himself and Chomsky had some spat in some emails over something reasonably trivial. And I think Chomsky mightn't have behaved all that well in the spat.
Yeah, well, I think, and the other point, I think this is worth making, and I'm not a linguist or a linguistics academic, but Knight, that's his day job, I think, is working in linguistics. So I think that original spat was an academic spat, I believe.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he's not coming from it. He doesn't come from a universal grammar school. I think.
Exactly. So you have
this double thing.
Exactly. So I think that's probably the background. And then later on that Thursday, returning to our program.
Yeah, wait now. I want to talk about Chomsky for a minute.
Okay.
Because Chomsky's it's just a point that I was talking to probably some of the people that we did the MacNair thing off air, and we were talking. I don't know how, because Chomsky was my road in, probably like you. But what's interesting with Chomsky is that he'll slag off Lenin and all these different people, but he never slags Marx, and he never critiques value theory. He never really critiques historical materialism, which is it's interesting.
It is
from
interesting.
An anarchist.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm not an anarchist, but I'm definitely closer to an anarchist than I am a Stalinist, is the way I put it. You know what I mean? And so I just thought I'd put that in there, because I do have a liking for Chomsky, I must say. Still.
Yeah, I've certainly not shed that as I've sort of perhaps become more radical, and I still have, many of his books on my shelf. And I think you're right. I've never heard him critique Marx, but it's so difficult.
He actually goes and says positive things about Marx.
I think he said he basically gets the economics completely right, but he then kind of makes that point that my dad would make, that when it gets implemented, because I think he comes from that anarchist background, that when it gets implemented, it's going to go bad.
But he doesn't even make that. I think he even makes the point that, like, Marx was closer to left-com than people actually talk about, as in that Marx in the latter years of his life did a lot of research on, like, the communes in Russia, and about how that, this decentralized basis might be a possible model for future. So Chomsky is like...
So in the way that some people try and reclaim the young Marx, Chomsky wants to reclaim the aged Marx.
Yeah, well, I think he's basically... I don't think he ever makes I think he blames other Marxists for bad politics and strategy as opposed to Marx. Yes. I just thought when we were talking about Chomsky, because we don't...
I agree.
Keep going there.
Yeah.
What's next?
Well, later in that day, it was MacNair speaking about... The title was Identity, Politics and Economism, Two Sides of One Coin. And this is it's a recurring theme within the weekly work, and not just from MacNair. And I think it's one of, as we were discussing off air previously, how it seems, as outsiders looking in, that there are elements of the way that the CPGB are formally organised, and I think do genuinely seem very positive. They are clearly open to debate. It seems that members within the party that don't exactly hold the same view can be in the same party, and it's not a problem. And that, the idea of factions are probably tolerated, as you were saying that the Dutch comrades were advocating for. One of the things I do return to, and I think the essence of the point is not incorrect that they make at the theoretical level, but it often gets made that intersectionality will negate the ability for the emancipation to move through the class. And I thought it was interesting, MacNair went back to his own early activism in the 80s, working in the gay liberation movement, and presented a material case where socialists, through practical organising and action, led to an emancipation within an element of society. And I thought that he made that case very positively.
Yeah, the miners, he was talked about how the Trotskyist group he was a part of, the
IMG.
The IMG, the International Marxist Group, so they are. And they basically got, lots of queer folk chugging for the miners during the miner strike, and actually going and striking with them, and I think actually fighting with them against the cops. And that MacNair tabled the motion at the Labour Party conference in 1983 or 4 or something like that. And it was basically because of how the gay people helped with the miners. The miners' union basically switched from being homophobic to being, what's the word?
Pro-gay rights.
Pro-gay rights. I was going to say homophile, but it sounds weird. I don't know what the word is. And so that was a major shift.
The thing that was interesting talk, and again, I think maybe it's worth returning to the way that the sessions were organised, because again, I think this is quite a positive thing that broadly on the organised left is something that, again, if you had any experience of dealing with Occupy or any of these more loosely organised assemblages, there is an organisation and a structure to the way that the talks were presented, that people made points and debate was conducted, that I thought was positive. People were given space to speak. They weren't cut off, and people could speak to each other. And I think that institutional knowledge of actually how to run meetings, how to run debates, is something that the organised left is very good at. And that kind of institutional knowledge is embodied in these groups. And that's one of the very positive things. And I thought over the course of the week, that was something that really stood out, that it really was a space where people could get up, they could say their piece, they could respond to each other, and there would usually be the initial talk, responses from the floor, then the speaker could kind of respond to the floor's responses, then there'd be some more responses, and then the speaker would wrap up, and there'd be kind of 3-hour sessions. But to be honest, I didn't look at my watch once in any of these sessions. Maybe once.
You didn't go to the platypus one.
No, but we can get onto that later. I'm looking forward to your breakdown of that.
But no, it's true. The general format was about a 45-minute talk, and then 2 hours of questions and feedback, and people would talk for. Like, it wasn't one of these ones where there's an hour of a lecture and 20 minutes at the end where it's crammed and no one gets to. It was like at the end of it, if you wanted to talk, you felt you could talk. Maybe also it's a function of the size of the room too. Like the room, how many people were at the session? Anywhere between 20 and 50 is probably around the numbers.
Somewhere around that.
Yeah, probably usually about 40.
Yeah, I think I went on both of the Saturdays, and I think on the Saturdays there were a few more, obviously, because it was a Saturday. But midweek, I think about that. Maybe as many as 100 on the final Saturday. I don't know, something like that. 80. I don't know. Who knows? But yeah, I think that's a good point.
So back to the identity politics. One of them, I don't know if they have a leader. I don't know what Jack Conrad's position is. As a comment, he got up and he gave like a very dramatic, impassioned talk about why intersectionality is bad, and he says, "Well, we don't care if like she's a woman or a black guy or a trans or a whatever. What we care about is her politics." And
a Marxist. We need a Marxist.
Yeah. Did he actually say Marxist? He did. I can't remember. Yeah. And while he's true in one element. I find it strange that Marxists can make that point and not look at structure. That you have got to look at structure. Like, I like to think of myself as a non-racist person. You know, my missus is black, my kid is mixed race. But, like, I certainly don't have an understanding, well, I certainly didn't, I'm improving, of the understanding of what is it to be living as a black person in a white country, and race. You know, you think, oh yeah, I'm not racist, but you don't understand it. And I think a party can't hope to be truly communist if it doesn't represent all aspects of life. And if we look around the room, now I know this is true of probably most of these trottish groups, small Marxist sects. Most of them are old. Most of the members are old. But you look around there, and I know that a lot of the people in the audience weren't even from the CPGB. They were from fellow travellers in other Marxist groups, which is a very positive thing. And there was good-natured debate with people and talk about their experience in the 1970 in this group and that, and you're in this one now and you're in that one. And it was all very camaraderie. It was actually very, very good. Yeah. At no stage was there any kind of, bar one guy I was at, but there was none of this rubbish that you would associate with all these groups. But what was the audience say? What was the audience? What percentage was male?
I would say it was probably 98% male.
It wasn't that bad. Now, there was usually, if there was 40 people there was usually 4 to 6 women in the audience, I would say. So I'd say 85% male. I would say of those women that were there, one of the members, Yasmin, I think she's Iranian. The other women were white. Of all the men that were there was one black gentleman, an older man, probably was 60, I'd say. Everybody else was white. Was there any queer representation? Not obvious. You know what I mean? There was no trans people. In fact, in the meeting, there was one extremely anti-trans comment by one of the older guys who I don't think is a member, but is like one of these kind of fellow travellers who made the right-wing points of like, oh, I can identify as a spoon. Why is, trans stuff is just mental illness or something. And it was really negative. After the talk, I basically got a bit angry and I made a point, and I, not in an angry tone really, but I just basically, what would you say? I said, I chided them. Was that a word?
I think that you just kind of,
I said I was disappointed about
you let it be known that you did not feel that it was something that made the space inclusive, which I think was a really good point to make. And it made it be known that you weren't happy with what was said.
Yeah.
And you kind of said, this should be a group where you're trying to welcome people in, and I don't think that's a very inclusive comment. And I think that there were other people in the room who, they didn't quite applaud, but there were people that responded very positively to the comment that you made. And that was really good and it was encouraging. And then after the talk, MacNair actually came and spoke to us. And he kind of said, I think he said, good for making the point. It's important to make, the point. And he said, but we've had way worse.
He did, but he said that people should be able to say what they feel.
And I think we agreed with that. I said that Tom should also be allowed to say what he feels. And then they said, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I said, I should, I don't have any problem with the guy saying it, but I don't think he should be immune to critique or whatever. But the other thing is, it's not just simply a thing that that everything's open for debate, because we don't have talks on why we think child paedophilia is a good thing. If somebody was in the meeting there and said, "Oh, well, I think children are very sexy," and we should be having where's our paedophile faction in the CPGB? People would run them out the door. You'd be reporting them. They'd be reporting them to they probably wouldn't report them to the cops. I don't know what different organisation. If that's WP, they wouldn't report them to the cops. But so certain things, or if somebody was making explicitly racist arguments, I don't think that they would be welcome. So I think that certain things aren't acceptable in these things. So I'm a free speech advocate. I'm a kind of one who's more towards the absolutist end of it. But I don't know if that argument is quite true. But he said something about how the majority of people who wear women's clothes are cross-dressers and they're not getting represented in the debate.
I think that he did make that point, and I think it's a point I've actually heard him make before. And I think it's a structural critique on his part, that the way trans culture has moved and become more widespread, he feels or perceives that there is an erasure of cross-dressing, which I think probably throughout the 70s and 80s was a more prevalent form of expression for people that had the urges that people can now manifest through trans culture and transitioning, that they used to, older people who are cross-dressers now, I think he felt there was a level of erasure or were being marginalised at the expense of more openness broadly in society towards trans people. I think that was the point he was trying to make.
I know, but what kind of a point is that? Because, the thing is, you could make let me make a similar point about, gay people. That, it's open now, it's all about gay people, and then, some people are maybe having homosexual experiences that are negative for them, or something I don't know if it was just about erasure. It also seemed to me he was saying something perhaps some people... He made a case where a friend of his daughter's was kind of felt pressure to become trans when they weren't. I kind of might have that wrong. Do you remember him saying something like that? I think
so, yeah. Very, very
So the reason why I bring this up is because the Weekly Worker has had some really anti-trans things in there.
They have. The only thing I would say is that when they've run it, they've usually the following week run a response. And again, it comes back to this idea that, there's forums for open debate and,
But who chooses what the debate is? Do they have ones that are anti-black people and then a response from a black person?
No. And again, that was the... Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's I was a little bit confused. I don't know if I'm misrepresenting Mike's stuff. I don't want to misrepresent him, but in light of what Lexi and some people have told me, that there was some quite anti-trans stuff in the Weekly Worker.
Oh, there definitely was.
Yeah, that I haven't. Yeah, it would lead me to believe that that's got to probably be somewhat representative of the editorial line has to be somewhat representative of the organisation. One would think that there must be elements within. It seems likely, looking from the outside, that there are elements in the organisation who have negative feelings towards the trans movement.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to speak for them or speak against your point, because I agree with you fundamentally. But I think a point that they might make is that, and this got brought up in one of the talks, and I don't think that it's comparable. But the point that they might make is, well, we published an article by Nick Rogers about how Lenin had read Marx wrong, and we, the CPGB PCC, disagree with that. So we're happy to publish stuff we disagree with so that we can debate it. And I'm not saying I agree with that, but I suspect that that might be their response to that. And I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that.
But have they had in the Weekly Worker, you've been reading it, how long have you been reading it?
3 years, maybe.
Okay. Have they ever had like anti-gay rights articles in it?
Exactly. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, it's a Harvard.
Yeah.
It's still, the fact that it's written says something. Yeah. I don't know what. I don't want to misrepresent people because I'm not into that. But what is the last one then? Okay, I went to the last one there. The where I was talking earlier about the Dutch comrades. They gave a talk on that.
And then was that the same evening as the platypus thing?
That was the next night.
Okay.
The Dutch comrades one was really interesting. They talked about all their strategy and what they're having to do, how they've got like a secret. They basically have a secret faction who are.
Do they have a WhatsApp group?
It might be a Discord. I think it might be Discord. Way trendier than WhatsApp. Old school WhatsApp. And they were. They managed to get a mole on the central committee of the party, and all the things they were trying to introduce. The mole was on the inside telling them about how they were like the central committee were trying to stymie all the reforms that these guys managed to get through. And so it was all very, very interesting to see actual people doing actual stuff in an actual party that are bringing forward stuff that weirdo podcasts like ours and weirdo books you're reading in your attic with the light off at 4 o'clock in the morning with a head torch on, you know.
I do actually do that. While my 6-month-old is asleep, I do read with a head torch on.
There you go. I knew by the look of
it.
I knew it. That intense stare. It's got to come from somewhere. Right. The next night, the previous day to you, I went to the Decline of Socioeconomic Systems in Our Epoch by Hillel Tickton.
Oh, so you went to the Tickton talk?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was, I missed the first half. I got the second end of it. He was making some point about like how the structure of modern capitalism is changing, where it's gone monopolist and how it needs new things to explain it. And honestly, I asked a question to him about, you know, when in these things, I never talk in these things. A lot of times I don't have anything to say. I'd like to hear an answer. So I didn't give a long speech or anything. I just said, like, do you not think that this tendency towards monopoly is inherent in like Marx's analysis of capital? And he then went on and talked about monopoly capital for 10 minutes and didn't respond to my question precisely. So I don't know. I think he may have been trying to avoid the question. So I don't know. I wasn't enough to talk to really give a full down. That's the only thing I can say about it. Yasmin Maher gave a talk. That's like an Irish person's pronunciation. It's probably Mather. I don't know. Yasmin, I think, she did one on why the US wants war, why Iran needs the threat of war, which was interesting geopolitics. That was a good talk. I don't want to go into the geopolitics of it, but it was good geopolitical analysis. And
she writes a lot of the articles I was talking about earlier in the Weekly Worker
on foreign policy.
Stuff that's looking at Iran, Turkey, she's often writing, and it's interesting, incisive stuff.
It certainly seemed to chime with my own thinking on the stuff. I'm drinking a lot of this homemade raspberry whiskey. I'm going to be so hungover in the morning now. Okay. Let's talk about the platypus meeting.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing about this. So, to preface this, Platypus comrades were around on the Thursday, and they had spoken during the open floor period of MacNair's talk and made some points that were...
An American girl.
An American girl, woman, indeed. And made, like you said, often you kind of want something from the floor that's going to spark, maybe like a question that's going to spark some response from the speaker that's dealing directly with what they were talking about. And it almost felt like some of the points they'd made seemed kind of pre-prepared, and they were things that they already thought and wanted to say, and it was almost like they were making declarative statements as opposed to engaging with the talk and the topic. And I don't know if that's me being overly cynical, having some understanding of the way that Platypus operates as an organisation, but it certainly seemed like that concretely in the moment. So I'd be interested to hear how the evening set. These are fringe meetings.
These are fringe meetings.
So where did they occur? Was it in someone's dorm room?
It should have been. It was, the fringe meetings are the later ones, but they weren't Vimeo'd. I don't think they were broadcast live either. The fringe events were the late night ones from like 8 till 10 or something, and they were not broadcast on the internet. I don't think they're recorded either, which would be good for Platypus, because this would have to be the worst talk of any description I've ever been to in my life. I can't remember. They don't have the title here, but it was something to do with Stalin. Something
to do with Stalin and the New Left.
I think that was basically the title. And it consisted of two kind of people giving a talk. One English guy, or two English people. There was a guy, maybe 25, and a woman as well, about a similar age. It was very funny because they gave this talk. The guy gave a talk. I can't even remember what he was trying to say. The woman gave a talk. She gave the impression that she had read 2 books on whatever topic she was talking about, had nearly no knowledge of the New Left or of the history of the left. And somebody from the floor asked her, there was an American woman that was out there, she was probably in her 60s, I'd say, and she asked them, like, well, what do you mean by the New Left? She asked the woman and on the stage, and like she says, because the New Left was made up of loads of different stuff. And one couldn't answer because I don't think she even knew who was in the New Left. And the woman basically, she said, well, she would drop a name like, oh, what about this guy? And then, the American woman was like, yeah, I knew him. I was in the organisation with him. And like, so what do you mean? Like, and then she'd say, oh, well, what about this other guy? I was in that. I knew him too. Personally, I went out with him for 6 years. Like, it was literally like a 24-year-old person who'd read 1 book, sitting up there in front of people who have actually been through the mill with all this stuff, trying to say something about their organisations when they knew nothing. Another guy asked a kind of a factual question about Stalinism to the other guy, and the guy was like, well, we don't want to talk about Stalinism. It was like, we want to talk about it in kind of more meta terms, and it was just the most painful thing. And the people started leaving one by one. I left after about an hour. I couldn't take any more. There was about a third of their previous audience left. They had sent, obviously, a minder. There was the person who made that point, I think, in your talk, who was a young American woman. She was about 24. She was obviously of a higher status in the organisation, I would say. It looked like she was sent from the US to be a minder for this session. She said, oh, I just happen to be here in the UK at the moment, so I just thought I'd come along. And she sat at the front, and when somebody would ask a question to the table that she didn't like, she would turn around and she would say, well, we're probably more interested in these other types of questions. It was just the most pathetic talk I've ever given. It was so bad. They obviously only wanted to basically interlock with Mike MacNair and maybe 1 or 2 other people. So when people would have their hands up for questions, there was a black gentleman sitting beside me, and he had his hand up, and everybody knew he had his hand up first. And they would look around and they would say, is there any questions? And then they would ignore the guy's hand, and people would say, oh, he's got his hand up. He has his hands up. And they would go, Mike, do you have something to say? Oh man, it was horrific. It was the worst talk I've ever been at.
It's almost worse because I can't get signal on my phone. If you look on the Weekly Worker website, they did a write-up, and there's quite a funny pithy sentence in there.
Okay.
So we can maybe give... It's pretty cutting.
Right.
There we go. So this is the Weekly Worker review. It says, in a positive development, there were 5 fringe meetings put on by non-CPGB comrades. Even if the quality was somewhat uneven, there was a rather incoherent opening on Stalinism and the New Left from members of the Platypus group.
There you go. It was just the worst who was the worst one of all time. Like the guy, the man who leads Platypus, the head chief. What's his name again?
Chris. I forget. It'll be on the internet. Chris someone. Chris Catrone.
Chris Catrone. Yeah. So
for the tape, that was before Google got it.
So Chris Catrone, like, he's a proper intellectual. He makes cunningly good Marxist arguments that somehow attract right-wing types to the, why not Trump? He has all these stuff, and he'll have good arguments, and he's if you had him in the talk group, he would be very well able to argue a point. But it looks like they're trying to train art house and critical theory types to waffle in a way that is similar. But the thing is, you have to be really, really, really good to waffle in that way. And if you're not, it just comes across as utter mediocrity and worse.
I think my perception, having listened to Catrone be interviewed, reading his exchanges with MacNair that went back and forth in Weekly Worker and on the Platypus website, he seems to be the thing that is that undergoes it is that he's essentially kind of a contrarian. But like you say, there's enough theory wrapped around the contrariness to be able to move from position to position, ducking and weaving. And like you say, you really need to know this stuff, particularly if you're going toe to toe with a lot of the guys on that floor. And again, this is a positive of this kind of a group. These guys have been doing this for a long time, decades, and they've been reading the Marxist classics, Marxist criticism for years. And I don't want to date us, but we're in our late 30s and we've been reading for a while. And this is not in any way to denigrate young people. Young people are wicked, but
they're evil and wicked.
But there's only so much time that you can have read stuff, and I think you're right that if you're going to kind of take on, and thinking back to some of the points that were made on the floor of the MacNair talk, they did seem kind of like contrarian points. And on the Saturday, some Platypus comrades again made points from the floor, and it was quite interesting because MacNair, and this is a talk that we could perhaps move on to. It was MacNair really talking about the stuff that's in the book. It was about I think it was called The Political Bankruptcy of the Left. Let's give it the correct title.
The Programmatic Bankruptcy of the Left and the Urgent Need for a Thoroughgoing Rethink.
There you go. could have been the subtitle to Revolutionary Strategy. But again, the Platypus comrades were there and made points that were kind of counterposing points that comrades from Workers' Fight were making from the floor against MacNair's point, and almost just kind of acting as a fulcrum to set them off against each other. So it was difficult to even comprehend what the point they were making was. I think he said that MacNair needed to reread Lenin, and that the Workers' Fight comrades needed to reread Kautsky. Because I think that the point that it was perceived, at least, that I think that, MacNair was arguing for kind of a neo-Kautskian position, and the Workers' Fight comrades were arguing for a more kind of Leninist position. But, be that as it may.
Well, the thing is, as well, is that the Platypus, your man, Chris Catrone's an ex-Spart.
Exactly.
And
it's in the lineage.
Their organisation, you could see how the organisation operated by the fact that they sent a minder. And it's the antithesis of the feeling you get in the CPGB of an open democratic discussion. The same type of open democratic stuff that actually attracts people to the Labour Party now in England and to the DSA in America. And probably to Syriza in these places. And unless you have that as a base, all that something like Platypus is a vehicle for a guru. That's what it is for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting reading back. I mentioned to you off air before. I've kind of been reading more kind of bourgeois, I guess, historians' accounts of the radical left in the UK over the course of the 20th century. And a point that they make again and again is that several of these sects really, what they're putting forth is what they would call a line, is essentially almost like a branding position to differentiate themselves from their contemporaries within the milieu. And I think that within the current left, Platypus does offer something quite different. That if you're a young student, because they're mainly operating on university campuses.
Rich ones.
Is often.
Only rich ones.
It's something that is attractive because it kind of gives you a patina of undercutting all the stuff that substantively, again, MacNair critiques in the book and consistently does, but with this kind of contrarian bent that allows you to kind of not be like, oh, well, let's talk about Stalin, but have no kind of claim to actually kind of engaging really with the kind of the underlying horror of what Stalinism was. They seem to almost be utilising, because again, they made points from the floor, utilising Stalinism as this abstracted theory, where it's okay to deal with it at that abstract theoretical level, but not really contend with the stuff that Ticktin was actually talking about.
Yeah, like it's shock jock from the left. You know, it's Bill O'Reilly. Bill O'Reilly of the left. It's
Howard Stern.
It's shock jock. Left is shock jock. Now, there was a couple of other ones which I didn't make. I got the end of the Moshe Machover and Tony Greenstein talk, which you got to?
No, I didn't get to. No.
On Israeli Jews, are they a Hebrew nation? You want to talk a bit on the anti-Semitism stuff?
Well, I just think, it's such a difficult topic to talk about, but I almost feel like you can't discuss an event of this nature without mentioning that these topics did come up. And it's a very deeply nuanced topic, more than I think that the opposing binary poles allow for. So I think that there are elements within the radical left that have, in many ways, an accurate critique, but can equally be occasionally accommodating, or perhaps too accommodating without enough critique, of views that from outside of the milieu can seem to the layperson like they are anti-Semitic. And I'm not accusing any individuals who attended or any individuals who spoke of that, but there were some comments from the floor in particular that did border into that territory.
On which talk was this now?
This was not at the Greenstein-Machover talk. There was
one I was at where there was a guy who you know his name, who was...
I don't want to mention him by name, but I think it's important, again, to raise the fact that this particular individual had tussled with the CPGB PCC as part of the Left Unity effort, the communist platform within the Left Unity effort, and they publicly denounced his views. But I think it's impossible to discuss this kind of event without the fact that there often are individuals who, even where there is a structural critique that may be correct, make statements that are, in the best case reading, inflammatory.
Yeah, there was a guy who was making the case for, like, oh, there's a material cabal of rich Jewish people in America leading foreign policy in a certain way. You know, which essentially, it's the old rich Jews running the world thing, just rewritten with a Marxist language, you know, and it's not a good critique at all. And he made that one gentleman made the comments in an Iranian, in the one about Iran, and I was sitting beside one of the Dutch young comrades, and he said, is that not like anti-Semitic, what he said? And honestly, I wasn't really paying attention. I was spacing out. I was looking out the window, and I was like, "Oh, I don't know." I you know. And then afterwards, I was at the next talk, the end of this, and a Greenstein talk, I think, and he started making similar comments, and it was like they were blatantly. I would think they're. To me, I find it. You know, you can make that argument, and then you can say you could get the counter argument. Well, actually, the reason why America is backing Israel in that part of the world is for geopolitical reasons. You know, and if it wasn't a geopolitically strong area, they wouldn't really be interested in it. And, you know, once you understand that actual extra element to the puzzle, you can say, oh God, now I just sound like a goddamn, you know, Elders of Zion weirdo. I better change my tack. And the fact that you don't change your tack means that there's something Elder of Zion weirdo stuff going on in your brain. That's the way I think about it. Like,
I think that's true. And the thing that I find I struggle with is that you would think there would be a level of self-reflection where people from the outside, particularly when elements within the CPGB PCC are working within the Labour Party, and I think that they see that beachhead that they're defending being attacked by what they perceive to be smears, and they're on the offensive. And the structural critique can be correct, but there are ways that you can go on the offensive that are not going to cause as many problems. So I think there are times when the language that's used, and I'm sure that they would defend this as being robust and resolute, and part of me understands that, but at the same time you can't take it out of the context of the current moment where it's only going to get accused of, you know, the witch hunt that they themselves fight against. And it is, I have no answer. I don't even know what my position is. As I've said to you, I have Jewish family, and it's something that I struggle with because there's a structural critique that on an abstract level I agree with, and there's a way of conducting the response to the critique that I can't help but at times find problematic. And I don't know whether that's right or wrong. All I'm saying is that I struggle with it. And that's just me being really honest.
Yeah, no, I just think it's one of those things where, like in defence of the CPGB, you can't stop people from coming up and asking comments and stuff like that.
Absolutely not. And I think that both of us agree
from my point of view, it was like one guy and everybody else was asking reasonable stuff. And I think like if you do the fight back, you know, it only takes you to say one sentence and say the sentence clumsily, and someone record it,
and they've got ammunition for days.
Yeah, and even if it's literally just, you know, God knows, I'm glad I have got the editing suite here because I say loads of clumsy shit. You know what I mean? So, did you go to the Saturday MacNair, the programmatic bankruptcy of the left?
I did, yes, and it was really good. But I think, you know, if you've read the book and you've read MacNair and you read his articles regularly, a lot of the stuff is stuff that you would expect. I thought what was more interesting in a way was the debate afterwards, but more from a nerd history, tactics, strategy perspective. It should be mentioned that there was a comrade from, I think he lives in Ireland, but he sounded like he was Australian or South African.
Yeah,
Antipodean guy.
Yeah, New Zealand, I think.
Yeah. From the International Bolshevik Tendency.
Okay, who the hell are they? I've never heard of them. He's a trot. He is a. I was talking to his wife, and she said he was a trot, so he must be a trot.
I mean, I'm sure that he would say he's an Leninist.
Yeah.
But he was an interesting guy. He mentioned in other parts. I think he's doing organising work in Ireland as part of Extinction Rebellion, trying to kind of radicalise or give Extinction Rebellion some politics, which they don't really have any of.
His wife was Anna Sheen, and she did one of the Russian Revolutionary Woman that was on Friday morning, which I didn't get to. Yeah. Which was interesting talk.
And she actually made some really good points from the floor as well during a couple of the other talks that I thought were really interesting. But yeah, it got into a kind of historic, strategic conversation. Again, members from Workers' Fight were kind of expounding a kind of very dogmatic Leninist position. Your man from the IBT was kind of, extolling the virtue of the Soviets. And it was very interesting. But I think the way that the talk had been billed, and this is not a critique of MacNair, it was just the way that it kind of went from the floor, was that it got kind of locked back into those historical discussions, which I think we're both very interested in and I found very interesting. But I thought there would be more of the, well, what do we do now thing, which is the thing I often look for in a lot of this stuff, and the thing that I found invigorating and energizing about reading the MacNair book the first time around. I was like, I've been reading all this theory, all these big, thick books, and here's this one that's like 150 pages long. And it's just like a little manual.
And just smashes
through. Here you go. Yeah, and it has all the history in, condensed, concise and clear. And
okay, so let's talk about this. The CPGB, they don't do what MacNair talks about. They do entryism into the Labour Party.
This is something that we were sort of
discussing. There's one line in that book where he slips in entryism into the Labour Party. He slips it in like literally one sentence, and God knows I'll have to go and look and find it. And in all the rest of it, he talks about how don't go into them, which is a very strange little... When you read that book, it's talking about don't go into government, don't go in until you have all the forces, and you need all the forces in all of Europe, and then go in. And then, what does their party actually do? They go into the Labour Party.
I think...
How do you square that circle?
Again, and I don't want to speak for them, you know, this has been a really great discussion, and I think, again, I said prior to recording that, you know, beyond encountering them through the prism of reading MacNair and reading The Weekly Worker, you know, you look around at the other groups, and by far and away, as I said at the beginning, the way that they approach things is the closest to my own personal, you know, conception and analysis of things. And I think that, and this is not to speak for them, but they would argue that, again, not in the same way that Bash was arguing, but that with the rise of Corbyn and the Corbynite left, as small as it is within the Labour Party, there is an opening there. And that socialists needs to organise where there is some socialist action occurring, even if it's happening within parliamentary politics at that level. So I think that they would, and again, if CPGB comrades want to come and have a discussion, I'd love to have it. I'd be very interested to discuss what their kind of strategic analysis of the situation is. But it seems clear that Labour Party Marxists, which is, and you know, it's not like it's advertised in the Weekly Worker, it's fairly clear that it's CPGB, PCCC, CADA that are running Labour Party Marxists. You know, I think
are they just in it, or are they it?
I think they are it.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a great quote. I've got a book by John Callaghan that John Callaghan wrote 2 books, one about British Trotskyism and a later one about the far left, and they mainly focused on the history of the far left up until the 80s when he wrote the books. And there's a great line where he's talking about the IMG, which is the group that MacNair came out of. And he did some statistical analysis looking at the number of members and the number of front groups that they were running at a given time. And by Callaghan's analysis, and who knows if this is accurate or not, he estimates that there were, you know, and I'm kind of making the numbers up, but it was circa 1,000 members. And there was so many front groups that there was only about 10 members per front group, because they were running so many front groups at a given time. But they were all members of the IMG. And I'm pretty sure that because, and again, I'd love to speak to them and find out more, but it seems like the CADA of the CPGB PCCC is so small that it's not like they can afford to just be recruiting more people to send off and be Labour Party Marxists. It's called CADA. Stan Keeble, who's, you know, ostensibly, if you read the Labour Party Marxist Bulletin, writes in it, is also a member of the CPGB PCC. And I'm fairly certain that the other members are all CPGB PCC CADA. And I think that's another interesting discussion. It's something that's fascinating to me about them as a group, is that they actually seem to maintain something closer to the Hal Draper idea of being a Marxist centre based around the Weekly Worker as a newspaper. So that's the centre around which they organise. And I think it's possible that that comes from their origins as being a faction within the old official CPGB, where they were based around the Leninist, which was a factional paper that they ran. And they've kind of maintained that around the Weekly Worker, and that the editorial board and relatively small CADA act as, I don't even know if they'd necessarily see themselves as vanguardist, but it's almost like a vanguardist, coherent CADA. And there's many fellow travellers who read the Weekly Worker around them who are paper, in that they read the newspaper, members of the broad tendency that they represent. And the actual members of the party, I think, are probably pretty tiny.
But it's weird. Like, it seems to act to me like some kind of think tank, like a left think tank. It doesn't. See, I don't know. Just going from just my first introduction to meeting the people who, for me, passed the smell test, I would say. I did enjoy the Communist University. Yeah, that they don't seem to operate really like a party.
Or along the MacNairist lines.
They don't seem to... Well, they do, as in it seems to be democratic and open and free in speech.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it doesn't seem to... It's not like they're trying to have a mass party that doesn't go into power. That strategy, the kind of Kautskian strategy. But it is interesting. You know, I feel... Well, personally, I don't know, like how Leninist most of them are. I feel just even design-wise, I feel like having a hammer and a sickle on the Weekly Worker is archaic. and I don't think it helps. Personally, I think a lot of older leftists and young Stalinists have a real, in Ireland we'd say a graw, but a
fetish.
Or a love, or some kind of, tainted love with the symbol, which is, I don't think is a good symbol. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. I always say that stuff. I think the hearkening to Soviet iconography is a negative thing on the left. I just think there are some that are probably good, but as a general rule, I'm full up for Marx and Engels and whatever you want, but like the Soviet stuff it's the big reason for why it's hard to talk about communism to people. I think, and again, there is an interesting kind of friction at play between the way that they try and look back at the failures and imagine a new tomorrow, but there is always this clinging to the success. And I think Derek said in a podcast a long time ago, I think one of the early analyses of the MacNair book, that tell me the year that you think it failed in Russia and I'll tell you what kind of Marxist you are. Yeah. And I think that it's clear from reading MacNair that he kind of thinks it was probably 1918. Yeah. I think so. I think that's clear. But even with that said, I think that there is still some... Well, he's an ex-trot. Exactly. And you have to kind of cling to the promise of 17, I think. And I think that's hard for people who've dedicated their whole lives to. And I think then that's, it's just very interesting for us in our kind of mid to late 40s, not having been in our 40s. 30s. You're 30s. Yeah, sorry. I'm not 30. You're 30s. I'm early 40s, but let's not go there. Yeah, slowly approaching the middle age. Mid to late 40s, you're getting a shock there, yeah. But it is just interesting because, as you said, in terms of age, we had a lot of guys and a few women in their 50s or 60s. Some older. Some younger. There was some younger. Anne McShane is younger. Yeah. But broadly speaking, there were the young comrades from Holland. The women were actually younger. There was another young woman who was Scottish, I think, as well. The women tend to be younger than the guys. Okay, maybe they fall into our cohort. But there did seem to be... There just is this disjunct between young, highly optimistic, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and then those who've been in the labour movement their entire lives. I would wonder, how did they recruit? I wonder, is there recruitment drives? There was one young guy there, I can't remember his name, but it seemed to be like he was like the one young guy who was in it, like literally the only one. I wonder, is recruitment even a thing? It doesn't even seem to be a thing. I think that goes back to, again, this is purely my spitballing and conjecture, that I think as a unit they adhere to basing it around the centre of the paper and the cadre being the membership, and that what they're more interested in growing is the broad movement of fellow travellers that read the paper around the movement, and that they're probably looking for... There's a term, I can't remember where I read it or heard about it, where they talk about the primitive accumulation of cadre, which is what organisations like the SWP do. Yeah. Anyone can come in. Yeah. Let's just get as many as possible. Yeah. And I think that they are more a fewer better, a more rigorous and radicalised cadre, and, we can grow things in terms of people that are reading the Weekly Worker. But again, I could be completely wrong. And I would love to have a conversation with a cadre member to discuss it further, because I do find it really interesting. Like, what is their strategy? Because if they're gonna continue, they need some younger people. And this was a point actually made by a comrade on the first Saturday. I forget which. I think he might have been in a group I'd never even heard of, Socialist Resistance or something. I think that was it. And he'd made the point that post Corbyn, he'd rejoined the Labour Party, become active in his CLP. And he was like, there are young kids coming into my CLP who are like 16 years old and are like mad for socialism. And he was like, you lot, the CPGB PCC, should be recruiting these guys. It shouldn't be a case of young people proving themselves worthy of your leadership. I think was exactly what he said. Yeah. You should be leading them. And part of me thinks if the idea is to grow a mass party, which seems to always be at the end of this, that's what we're going for. I don't know. Yeah. It's the thing with these smaller sects is that they want to control their politics. because they've read all the books. The Central Committee have read all the books and they've studied all the history, and they don't want some Johnny-come-latelys coming in a big wave, taking it over and driving it into the ditch.
Which, if you look at the DSA, is kind of what's happened.
It was in a ditch anyway.
Absolutely. I'm not disputing that.
Yeah,
but the old guard of the DSA...
That's what happened.
Gone.
Yeah, so the thing is...
I'm not saying that's bad, but here's what happened.
Yeah, like the thing is, like, they may drive a party into the ditch, but the thing is that you will never even get a chance to get wherever you want to go if you don't allow the movement in. That's the point I would make. Now, finally, I went to the summer offensive celebration dinner.
Yes, I want to hear about this.
And it was really, really goddamn good. It was the Friday evening. Now, we were talking earlier about like how you and me were like two isolated, alienated Marxists. I have some internet friends from running a podcast that we do shows and stuff on it, but that's about it. I do a reading group in my gaff now this year, and like that's trying to get into in doing some more praxis stuff. But we went there anyway, and they had the dinner, and it was all grand. But then afterwards, they did like a sing along, and they did well, it was more like people singing like radical songs, like German 19 whatever commie songs, Scottish commie songs, Irish rebel songs. There was some humorous ones. One guy got up and sang, he got cajoled into standing up and singing this Russian song, and it was about a young revolutionary in 1917 and how he got separated from his, like, he met this girl he fell in love with, this Ukrainian one, and then she ended up getting like shipped out to like Ukraine or somewhere, and he never saw her again. And like he sung this thing, and like he sang it in Russian, and I had no idea what it meant. And at the end, he was like went to this big, like this really emotional, and it was fucking brilliant. Now the guy wasn't like a brilliant singer or anything, but it was just like, it was just absolutely brilliant. And all this stuff, I've never been in a place where I had like this, like, it was a real sense of camaraderie. I left the thing and I was buzzing, I must say. I was really buzzing. And I cycled home, and I cycled on the Thames from there. I go on the Thames and I cycle like through all the industrial wasteland stuff, and it's maybe a 10 or 12 mile cycle to where my gaff is here. And I was dying for a piss because I had a couple of beers, and there's these old jetties that jut out along the Thames where there used to be a factory, and now there's not, but the jetty is still. And I went out, and I was like, God, I said, I'll go for a piss off the end of the jetty right out in the Thames just for a bit of it was like midnight or something at this stage. And I was like going for a piss, and I looked on the ground. Somebody had done some graffiti on the ground and was like, would you be happy if you died today? And you know what? I was so buzzed after coming out of that sing along. I was like, fuck yeah, I'm really buzzed. Yeah, fucking take me now, Lord Jesus. And it was really brilliant. And the thing is that, like, all these isolated leftists, like, look, most of the people who are on that we do the MacNair thing, you know, you got Lexi or Derek, myself, who else is there? Like Puya, Sophia. Most of us, some more than others, are isolated leftists, and you don't get any sense of camaraderie. And my God, that stuff is that's what it's about. Like, that's at least 50% of the goddamn thing. And it really shocked me how much I went, God damn it, like, all this cerebral nonsense we talk on these podcasts, reading our books, thinking, oh, you look at all these wankers on their phone playing, you know, some game or something, you know, and it's like, you know, I'm reading MacNair here, look at me. And it's like, that stuff is, that's bullshit, like, as in, you've got to connect emotionally with people and culturally and spiritually. And it was like, spiritually, I'm a goddamn atheist, but it was like, it was brilliant. And I know we've been critiquing a lot of the stuff, but like, I must say that was really excellent. And I've been around, I haven't been in organisations, but I've seen like leftoids operating, SWP types and these different types. And, you know, you go to a Stop the War thing, or you go to Occupy, which is supposedly an anarchist one. I don't know how much. It might have been set up on anarchist principles. There was loads of
loads of
SWP and all these people all around it. And there's a smell test problem.
Yeah.
That you just see them and you just go, oh, I don't know. And maybe that's because I was not as open at the time to that stuff. But I don't think so. And one thing I've got to say for the CPGB, even if we have disagreements on different things or others, about the trans stuff, I found a little bit questionable, to be honest. But they passed the smell test. I think they're definitely genuine people, and I wouldn't put people off going to them. The podcast, I won't join any organisation because I prefer to be independent. But I came out of it feeling very positive about the whole Communist University and the talks. They were really, in the general, the atmosphere and the talks was very good. What did you?
I think very broadly I agree. And like I said, I've been reading the Weekly Worker for a couple of years now, and do
you get a print one or do you read it on your phone?
I get the print one.
Do you? Wow.
Yeah.
How many pages is the print one?
12 pages, I think.
Every week?
Yeah. And I think that in and of itself actually is no small thing. It's a commitment.
That's massive. Yeah.
I used to managing edit a monthly magazine, so I literally know what it takes to put something out in print. And to put out a 12-page printed newspaper every week with interesting, informative, both contemporary and historical debate and analysis is pretty fucking impressive. That's like no small thing. And I think that, that should be commended and that's their roots. But also the stuff that they advocate for in the paper, and I agree with you, when I went to Communist University, it's not a load of hot air. There might have been things that, we have critique stuff, but broadly I would completely agree that my overall feeling was one of positivity. And that in one of these groups at least, there is something that is true to what they profess to be and was, broadly speaking, a positive period of time that I spent engaging with ideas that I engaged with through their print organ, and it was an interesting manifestation of what they espouse. And at the base, like you said, there's elements of what was discussed that we both found problematic, but overall it was a very positive experience, and I would certainly not discourage people to engage with the print publication, the videos, or their arguments. And so overall I was very glad to have attended Communist University 2019.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I would say as well is that I was talking to somebody who runs the London Left Culture Club. He was saying he was thinking of going, but it was so expensive. But that's only for the boarding.
Yeah.
So if you're doing a room, it's actually really cheap. It's only like £10 a day or something. But yeah, what I would say as well is that, while we have been critiquing a lot of stuff, you go into any bunch of any people, you're going to have disagreements with people over stuff. And it's easy being this isolated leftist and saying, oh, well, I liked most of it, but I don't like what they said on this. But that is politics. And if people are interested in actually being political and not being a consumption, because I do find that a lot of my stuff is I consume politics. It's not a political act. I'm hardly political. I might produce, maybe that's a political act. But and I'm sure a lot of people and listeners will admit it themselves, they're consumers of the podcast, but they don't act.
I put my hand up. I am one. And I think that what's almost worse, and it's actually something that I try and avoid. I mean, I do it on Twitter. When I'm doing it, I feel at best ambivalent and probably negative towards it, is that if you are not actually acting, and this is something that's important, and it goes back to them producing the paper, going out and organising protests, they actually do stuff. And that is important. You can agree or disagree with what it is they do, but they actually do stuff. And beyond, I go on anti-fascist marches, I go on protest marches, I don't do much more than that. And part of the reason I attended was because in a small way, I subscribe to the newspaper, so I'm supported through that. I used to go and buy it in Houseman's, which is the radical bookseller that's around the corner from where I work in King's Cross. But once I had kids, I couldn't even get out of work to go and buy a newspaper. So now I subscribe, and I'm willing to support them because there is more than enough good in what they do, practically, in my perception, to support. And I think that a lot of people, and I think it's a lot to do with social media and the way that people communicate, people just have to have a fucking opinion about everything. And a lot of people have opinions about politics that they don't carry through. And one of the things I remember when I was younger and before social media, do you remember when the Euston Manifesto was published?
The which?
The Euston Manifesto. This was the decent left. This was
the
in
Euston Manifesto.
The Euston Manifesto it was called.
When was that? What year?
This was, I think Derek might have admitted to signing it. It was what a lot of people who were a lot of them who were lefties that wanted to become...
What year are we talking about?
Post-Iraq. It was a lot to do with Western imperialism and just wars and this kind of stuff. But I remember when that occurred, this was all happening like just as I was coming out of uni. And I've always paid attention to politics. I did like a politics A-level. It's always interested me. Yeah. But I remember thinking that a lot of these guys that were like, taking their positions based on the Euston Manifesto, I was like, what are you doing? Your whole politics is taking positions on things. Like, where is the practical application of your position? For you, your politics is having a position. And unfortunately, and I'll be the first to admit this, that's me a lot of the fucking time.
Yeah.
Is all I do is take positions on things. And I think what you said is really important, that there has to be a point where you try and go beyond taking a position on things. Yeah. So it was really interesting interacting with people who are actually doing something.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, as well as it's saying there, is you're never going to find a perfect political party. Politics has to deal with people. People aren't perfect. People have shitty ideas. People have good ideas. You think they're shitty ideas. The only way you can change them is by action. And it's so that's one thing I would like to say. If we're critiquing stuff, we're not critiquing it in a way to say, this place, this is shit. It's more like we think, work that needs to be done here or there, like in every organisation. Overall, very positive, and I enjoyed it, and I'd recommend people going again, even just for the talks.
Absolutely.
If you're just interested in talks.
I think if you went, and it's not something, again, being the age I am and having young kids, and also the fact that I live down the road from it, I ain't going to stay there. But if you did want to go and stay there, and you spent a week there, listening to all the talks, interacting with the people there, I think it would be, even if you disagreed with most of the positions people were taking, you would have a very interesting week of challenging, thoughtful talks, debate. You can stick your oar in. I thought it was really,
there's
really
a good smattering of eccentric weirdos there too.
Absolutely.
Myself included.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thanks very much. It's 20 to 11.
Yeah,
we've done a good bit. So thanks for coming on the show today, James.
It was my absolute pleasure.
On this episode, you heard the theme tune, The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters, and The Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening, and please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit and Swampside Chats.